Welcome to Human Risk, a podcast dedicated to the understanding of human behaviour as a risk. Here's your host, Christian Hunt.
Hello and welcome back to the show. On this episode, I'm looking at what we can learn about being more human from the fire service. And we don't generally come across the fire service unless something unpleasant has happened. And it's those times when we're vulnerable that we're most in need of the human touch. On this episode, I'm speaking with David Wales, who used to work in the fire service and has now switched to focus on product design and customer experience. If that sounds like an unusual transition, then it is, but as you'll hear, it also isn't. Because during his role in the fire service, David wanted to understand why people didn't always do the things they were told to. For example, they'd rush into dangerous situations to rescue pets or laptops. What he discovered was that there's a gap between the theory of what people should do and the realities of what they actually do. And that means that the advice people receive is often not helpful for the realities they're facing. What makes sense to the fire service in theory might not match the realities of people's personal experiences. And that led him to a career in looking at customer experience, where the human touch is equally important. So in a wide-ranging discussion, we explore risk communication, the impact of emotions on customer experiences, the complexities of customer centricity, and the role of the human element in various aspects of our lives. David talks about how it's important to understand intuition in crisis management and the importance of tailoring safety messages to individual circumstances. We also look at how everyday attempts by companies to manage risk or reduce costs can be detrimental to their long-term business. So you'll hear some interesting anecdotes about parking ticket machines, supermarket checkouts, posters on trains, and pianos in railway stations, plus a whole load more. I found David's insights thought-provoking and fascinating. I'd never really thought about the fire service in the way that he talks about it, and I think you will too. So please enjoy my discussion with David Wales on risk communication and customer experience. David, welcome to the Human Risk Podcast.
Thank you, Christian. It's a great pleasure to join you.
I'm thrilled to have you here because I know we're going to have a fascinating conversation. But to kick us off, can you tell my listeners a little bit about yourself?
Of course, I've perhaps had an unusual journey to where I am now, but my background originally was in the fire and rescue service, which was my first career. And it really was a catalyst for me becoming very interested in human behavior. And we started a study based on a question that resonates still strongly with me of why don't they do as they're told? And that was in relation to our expectation of how people behaved in emergencies, not conforming to our belief in the way we'd organise our systems. And I'm sure we'll touch on that a bit later. But for me, that and a number of other things really kind of set me off on this journey of understanding human behaviour as it is, and perhaps not as we'd like it to be. After the end of the study, we really looked at what do we learn from it? And one of the key things was we'd lost connection with the citizens, the public we serve. And I didn't have a budget at that time. We'd done 6 years of study by that stage, but I didn't have a budget to really take it on. So I thought, where else has had the same problem and solved it? And we looked at the customer experience sector, where of course all the big brands know instinctively and through the investments they make, how to stay close to customers and the behaviours that are changing. And so I was able to go into that world and really start to look at the way they thought about issues, the tools they used. And the result was I was appointed as the first customer experience manager in the fire and rescue service to bring in mindset and methodology. And that was my last role with the service. And it was an absolutely fascinating journey, having learned about the citizens or the public, to then learn about organisational responses to something so very different and alien to the way that we organised and thought. Because I think when I started to study, I was 20 years into my career, and it was the first time I'd ever spoke to the public in the way of just saying, tell me your story, your words. Beyond that, they'd been a means to collect the data we already deemed to be important. So that was kind of the fire and rescue service bit. And I left that 4 years ago to set up my own company as a shared aim. And the idea really for that is about bringing together different perspectives and not with a view that one then has to be right, making another wrong. It's about they're all valid. And I think for organizations, the success is being better able to assimilate different perspectives, even where they're perhaps inconvenient or not the ones we believe. Initially, I positioned it as a customer experience company, but really increasingly the thing that unites my work is about human experience and a particular view of what human means. So I still do some work in advisory capacities for crisis and disasters internationally. And the reason I maintain that is because I think each can learn from other. And I love the intersections. I love people that come at things from different angles. And in the crisis space, obviously, the ability to understand uncertainty and risk is very well established, and there's lots of that comes back into the commercial sector. But equally, in the commercial sector, there's a very good understanding of customers, service design, and those sort of things, which is less well established in the crisis space. So as much as I can, I want to keep it active in both, and then kind of shuttle insights across.
And I find that fascinating because if you sort of said customer service or user experience, when it comes to the emergency services, it's not something one naturally thinks of. And yet the word service does exist. So clearly the fire service, police service, ambulance service, it all talks around providing a service. And yet, as you've highlighted, there is this disconnect. I describe it as how we would like people to behave versus how they're likely to behave. And so there are a set of principles that these services have established, which is sort of a logical response. This is what we need people to do to be able to do our job. And as you've pointed out, that's not what people often do in reality.
No, and I think it is fascinating, and I come at it from a degree position of empathy, not criticism, because these things evolve. But if you look at any service, when we had smaller communities, health was what the community did. Emergencies, all the community got involved. As we grew bigger communities, as they became more dense and the risks changed, we institutionalized those. We created a fire service, we created a health service, we created police service. And that was great. But I think what we're seeing now in many areas, and to a degree, some commercial companies, is the gap between those and how they work is becoming evident. And I did a piece of work when I was in the fire service and looked through some national strategic documents that were published through government or consultancies and various bits. And every one of them said, for the public. That was a default answer as to why the justification in many, many areas. But the reality is there was no mechanism to see what the public wanted, other than sometimes going out to doing consultations, which in truth, maybe loaded in favour of the answer that was expected. But sometimes there wasn't an ongoing meaningful engagement and a willingness to necessarily hear the experience as it was, rather than as we imagined it. And I think, as you say, the difficulty then is as institutions become bigger, they have responsibilities as an employer. What builds around that then is obviously accredited unions and other representatives, professional bodies to support the development, funding, stakeholders, regulations. These are all very visible, influential, and have mechanisms directly impinging on the services day to day. Public don't. Their voice is weak. And so you can have this generic approach of we do it for the public. And let's say genuinely I accept that intention is well meant, but things change. And the thing that really struck me is we have to do your job. And that's why, as I say, this is about a shared aim. If you have a fire in the house, the fire needs to be put out, obviously. But understanding what it means to that person, understanding how you do it is really important. And that's the bit that wasn't coming through. And regulation's not always good at portraying the human experience. And I think in any sector, that's probably true. It has a role to play and it's necessary, but not sufficient. And I think what I really was struck by when I sat down with members of the public and said, tell me your story, your words, is so personalized. Whereas I thought of the science and technical approach of putting out fires, that's what I've been trained to do. When you spoke to the public, of course, they're not interested in that. We come up with our thing. What they spoke about was the decisions they had to make, how it felt, and how it in the short term or how they foresaw the impact of what that meant to them. And I think one of the big learnings was small fires or small events can have major impact. And when you have a data criteria collection system that kind of categorizes by volume, it misses that completely. So for us, what were very small incidental fires, I was hearing from people that had life-changing impacts that were avoidable. And I think that's the bit that was come back to. If you listen, if you understand what's needed beyond your core function, there's a lot of avoidable harm that exists in there. So I think we do get used to working the way that we like to, or the way our systems are guided. And it doesn't always make them responsive or in tune with the human experience at that level.
And so you're talking, I presume, for example, about the fact that you come and say it's a small kitchen fire,
but for someone else, that's their home and they've had an incident in it. Or why do people go back into burning buildings to pick things up? Because that's dangerous. They should stay out. But actually, they're going to pick up their treasured possessions or their passport, or is it something that matters to them? And therefore, it strikes me, you would look at it and say, what's the scale of the fire? Whereas actually for people, it doesn't matter if it's a small fire, if it's something significant happened or they need to take decisions that are based probably more on emotion than anything else. That's where the tension is. That's what you're talking about, right?
It is. And I think, as I say, we tend to, I mean, certainly when you think about customer experience and marketing, we create personas which take us some way closer to humans, but it tends to also create a standard version of a standard idea with characteristics, I guess, of in that way. And we're not. We change during the day. We may get good news, bad news, feel tired, feel energized, have had a really good conversation with somebody that makes us want to go off and do something. And we may have health concerns, financial concerns, obviously currently at the moment for many people as well. All those things are at play. So I think this idea of kind of a standard version of a standard person doesn't really hold up. And we have to be, I think, if we want services to really be authentic and engage people and be genuinely helpful, we've got to take into account variability more. And you're absolutely right. For some people, if the standard advice, I mean, one of the ones that really came out quickly for us with that was the role of pets. Now, the advice was, and probably still is in many respects, is just leave your pet. I don't have to tell people, I don't have to get data out to tell most people. That's a ridiculous statement and standpoint. Particularly in the UK, we love our pets. And when we started talking to people, I think the first group we spoke to was 10 people who'd already had minor fires and minor injuries. Of those, 8 had pets. 7, their behaviors were primarily driven by concern for the welfare of their pet. Now, we can tell people that's not what we would like all day long, but they won't change. And even at the level of a laptop, one of the things I was trying to say is, some people, a laptop is just that, it's replaceable. If you think about it as a piece of equipment, it means nothing. Yes, we're not short laptops, so we can get another one. But if you think of it, it's either got treasured photographs on, it may have all your business dealings in. So it's not just a laptop. It represents possibly the next 5 years of your business, and what you've worked for the previous 5 before that. So I think we're not good at allowing for individuals to identify what they value. And you're right, for some people, the kitchen may not be in action for a couple of weeks, may not be an issue. But at certain points in our life, it may just be the straw that broke the camel's back. It may just be the thing that tips you over. So of itself, it's not maybe a great deal. But in combination with what else is going on in their life, it may just be a tipping point, creates a bigger hazard. And if everyone treats them in isolation, we miss the harm, or the vulnerability perhaps that sits there. And so you're right. I think we just got to be a little bit more accepting of that variability that comes and goes in everyone's life. We never stop being a human, even though we attract that label of customer, patient, student. The rest of us doesn't stop at the door.
And it just struck me as you were talking that in many respects, that theory about how we'd like things to work is a business to business logic. And actually what you're dealing with a fire in a home is business to consumer in the loosest possible sense of it. And so, yes, of course, there should be a well-drilled fire. If you went to an office, there would be a well-drilled fire protocol. They will have smoke alarm. There'll be a whole load of things in place that some of which may be in place in a domestic environment, but people aren't going to be as well drilled. I think it's really interesting when we look at things like smoke alarms. We ask people to test those, and we repeatedly have to tell them to test it because, I've bought the thing, it'll be fine, kind of thing. And so there's almost a businessy logic to it, which if you've got the infrastructure to do that and there are rules governing it, you can do. But actually, when it comes down to individuals in their own environment, quite rightly, I do what I want in my own home. That's my own personal freedom. And so what you might be able to get away with in terms of telling businesses, you're going to struggle to do with humans. So we really need to start thinking about the human at the end of it and engaging them on a human level as opposed to on a theoretical level.
Absolutely. And I think design has a huge role to play. And I think where the issue really with that entrenched thinking is it doesn't open up new ways to solve problems. Because what you end up with is that continually shouting don't. And I think particularly where, I don't want to keep going back to example in some ways, but the fire one is kind of useful to understand that if we just say don't tackle a fire, leave the professionals, then you've boxed off any other solution. But the public will be the ones that discover the fire, namely in their home. There is a period of time that waits for the response. What we've failed to do, if you have that purely as this is the only option, we don't want you, you've lost a period of time where the fire is developing, doing more damage, where people will then decide to take action themselves. And I think one of the things around that risk communication is we imagine often a single version and we often imagine the worst version. So when we say there's a fire in the home, those in the profession will often think of the raging inferno and say it's far too dangerous to go in. The public know that, we're very good. If it's fire coming out every window, very few people go in unless there's something really compelling, like they just feel they've got to make an attempt to save a loved one. But generally, we get that. At the other end, a lot of fires are very, very small and not going anywhere. So maybe smoke coming out of the toaster. Again, they're very good at making that risk assessment. But there's a piece in the middle that's getting lost, a single generic message that people have to make decisions. And that's where the risk is. So if you took a risk-based approach, you could almost bookend the two extremes and say, this is where people need choice. So what is a fire? What do we mean by that? How does that relate to your particular capability and circumstance? Is it safe for you? So I think the generic message, it becomes very difficult and it shuts off thinking about other ways. Design for me, product design, is definitely where we need to be investing, and data we collect should inform those people that can come up with new ways. So, because as you say, smoke alarms, with the best will in the world, not many people are going to be testing that weekly. And I think manufacturers would say, arguably, it's not necessary either. So you can't, I think when you look at it again, as somebody who, if you have your own house, one message is around fire safety, another maybe about child safety, electrical safety, water safety. And I think, again, that silo approach, we forget that people are being bombarded by messages that often aren't relevant to them at that time. The time you want to know about fire is when you discover you've got one. 5 years before, a year later, it's no use. So again, there's a timeliness around that whole risk communication education piece. And I think that's what's fascinating to me, to try and just reimagine some of the things we do and say, is there a difference between if I said, for example, I want to improve the fire service, to let's make people safe in their home from fire? And I think you start to think different ways around it then.
And I think that's really interesting because what you're driving towards with a lot of that thinking is raw human emotion. And I think one of the things, if I look at an instruction to get out and not to try and tackle it myself, there'll be all sorts of things going through my mind, which is, well, why would I let this thing get any worse if I could do something about it? The fire service is a scarce resource, particularly in current environments. So I don't want to waste their time with something pointless. And how hard can it be? And my gut instinct is to want to do something. And so I don't want to be in a situation where I could have prevented something from happening, where I've wasted public resources, where it might take them what will see, it might not be a very long period of time in reality, but will seem like an eternity. So for all those things on a basic, visceral human level, and bearing in mind, of course, we don't experience fires every single day. Unlike the fire service, which that's their job, you see it all the time. As an average human being, we tend, it's not something we've got any great amount of experience with. So our ability to sort of go to a tried and tested thing is going to be slightly changed. Even if we've been told what to do, gut instinct is always going to jump to the fore. And we're just going to want to do, not doing something feels like the wrong answer. And so for all of those basic human emotional reasons, in the clear light of day, if I've had lots of time to practice and get used to it and got the mental muscle and all those sorts of things, then we might be able to come to a different position. But what you're highlighting there is really, it's real humans in real situations that they've probably never come across before, being expected to behave logically.
It is. And I think the area there is whose logic, because an organizational logic or a professional logic is not the same. And so one of the big things that we really learned was the role of embarrassment. That when you call for service like that, we don't arise subtly. And so they was very aware that neighbors would see the noise, and some people just don't like that level of attention, or may have reasons not to want that level of attention. And it is, I think, as I say, many organizations, and what's fascinating me is that as I went away from the fire service into the more commercial world, you see the same behaviors, that degree of, well, this is the world that we've created and how we see it, and now people aren't conforming. Why not? And I think, one of the areas I'm fascinated by at the moment is supermarkets. Now they changed the rules for us from us going into, you had, I suppose you go back 15 years, there's a single way to use them. Effectively, you went in store, went round, went through the checkouts. Then when we started to be introducing self-service, which presumably is mainly driven by the efficiency and price aspect of it, which is entirely reasonable. But we are now getting to a state where that self-service, particularly route, we're being encouraged to use because there's less checkouts available. But they keep adding layers and layers of security, because obviously now there is a security issue around theft and different behaviors in public. They've created an opportunity. Their response to it is interesting to me, that at one level, you have all the loyalty schemes where they personalize the offering to you and say, look, we know you really well. Yeah, we've got you. We know you bought this last week, so we're going to give you 10% off this week. So at one level, they're doing that loyalty and personalization and engagement. The other is that, having used a supermarket for many, many years, I go in there and I go through about 8 layers of security. I am treated, even when I'm buying a bottle of milk, as if I'm going to steal from them. There's no allowance for the fact that they know me at that point and say, well, you've never stole from us, so we have no reason to believe you will. I am just treated, and for whatever the percentage of people that do steal from supermarkets is, the rest of us are treated at that level as well. And I think it creates now increasingly a very unpleasant human experience. I don't enjoy that aspect of it. And yet even now, the strategy for many stores is to keep putting another layer of security on. And I think, at what point do you accept that is not the answer? Because this strategy of just incrementally adding a bit more without necessarily a vision of where it takes you or the impact it's having elsewhere seems an interesting one. And as you know, a certain in that respect, but I do think, as you say, that we've got, my sense is that human experience, the lack of understanding people authentically, starts to explain many of the issues that businesses have faced for a long time, because the traditional approaches aren't solving them, because these issues have been around a long time. And I think it probably is because you've got this dilemma between how we would like to organize things efficiently and neatly compared to when we turn up as humans. That's not us.
Well, I mean, it's true, as you were talking, that I was thinking back to sort of Scooby-Doo, right? I'd have got away with it if it hadn't been for those pesky kids, right? You know, I've designed a perfect system that this is going to work brilliantly. And then the idiot humans come along, and everything from just do what they think is the right thing to do, or through to mischievously gaming the system and playing with it a bit, or actually actively setting out to do the wrong thing. And so we have this stylized version of the world that we'd love to have exist, but we all know we all know this instinctively, right? None of us, unless we're slightly strange, none of us does exactly what we're told all of the time. We don't all read instruction manuals. We don't all pay attention to things that logically, I mean, airline safety briefings, I think, is an interesting example where, in theory, you should want to know what happens if there's an incident with a plane. That's a perfectly logical thing to do. But we've got a million and one other things going, oh God, here's another lecture. And even when they do their damnedest to make it engaging, and they say this, right? You know, please put your papers down. They know that we're not paying attention. So at least in that context, they're trying to engage us. But I think this tension between a beautifully stylized view of the world and humans, with all their foibles and all their different, it's a very different thing. And so I love the way that you've looked at that, because I do think if my job is to manage a particular risk, it is much easier for me to define it simply. It's also much easier for me to justify whatever decisions I've made to whoever it is I need to justify. Look, here's a beautiful schema. Here's a flowchart that people can follow. They know what to do in that situation. My job is done. And of course, that looks lovely in a file somewhere on a screen. But when it comes to real humans in the real world, that's a bit more challenging. And so it's almost like the very dynamics that propel us to do what we might think of as illogical, irrational things in the moment are also very, very human responses to the situation.
They are. And I think an example that I've had last year is, if you took a company like Netflix, it's really invested in the personalization agenda. And what I find interesting is that balance between where does personalization work and when doesn't. I actually canceled my subscription over a year ago because what I realized was that I was spending more time scrolling through than I was watching. And it's because at some point I may watch, I say, a historical drama. And of course, the algorithms picked that up and said,
Now that's all you want to watch ever.
absolutely, we've got you. And it's almost like that, right, you're in the crosshairs. We've nailed you. We know who you are, David. This is what you want. But of course, the reality is by the time you've watched the top two, the quality of the rest is going down. They're not ones I wanted to watch. It may also be that I'm in a different circumstance. I may watch that on my own, and next time I'm scrolling through with my family or with friends or just in a different mood. And so I think what's interesting to me with things like that is, do we actually want personalization, which kind of says, now we know who you are, you're just going to get this constant diet of more of the same. And for some people, maybe that does work. And again, it's trouble with rules is they're always there to be broken. But I think for me and many other people I've spoken to, I just want good navigation. Just make it easy to find what I want. And I can decide the rest. So Netflix don't need to know me to that extent. I would argue that I don't even need to know me particularly well at all. That may be where they focus in certain respects. They can change the images we see for each film and do things like that. But at the level of choosing what I want to watch, it gets difficult to break out of the algorithm and find the things that I would otherwise have explored. And so I think those areas are ones where we've really got to be more realistic around the role, point at which we intersect with people. And I don't think personalization, for the sake of it, is actually going to serve many companies well. I think, so that's one example. But in many areas, as you say, that real understanding what it means to be human. And last year, I did a post. I was fascinated. I was encouraged by the rise of people talking about humans. So we're talking about human experience, human-centered design, rehumanizing after the digital programs of COVID and things. But my question was, what do we mean by human? As a professional, is that a set of qualified traits that you come from some research study or somewhere else? Is it a feeling of it's how I'd like to be treated, it's how I treat my mum? So kind of what is, if we're going to design that in a professional sense, designed to humans, whether that's as a customer, an employee, or as a stakeholder, what does that mean? Because if I said culture, the first thing you say is, well, what is your culture? How do you define that? How do you exhibit it? How do you make it real for people? And yet I'm certain and actually welcome the fact that we don't all have the same view of human. It's almost like a marketplace with lots of different products. So people see human different to me, and that's perfectly brilliant. What we're not seeing is on the agenda of organizations, a genuine attempt to say, how does that human piece fit into this? And I think, particularly in the technology sector now, I'm seeing some really, what I would argue is clumsy adoption. One of the things in certainly local high streets, we value conversation. We value the interaction we have. But I'm going to, even to high streets, we've got small cafes that are directing me to a QR code. I think that maybe in a big restaurant, in some of the cities, that's okay. I get why it's there. But at local level, the human contact's really important, just a little chit chat. And I think we're taking out so much of that at our own peril.
One of the things I think is fascinating, it came out when you talked about, what do you mean by human? And you'll get a ton of different responses, is that we may be predictable in many cases, but we also like things to be unpredictable, right? We like surprises, nice surprises, I hasten to add, not the nasty ones. And so we don't like being told what to do. We all want to be unique and we all want to be special and all those sorts of things. And so I think for me, it's interesting. The way I sort of square the circle is to say that I think organizations can be really smart about this stuff if they recognize that particular tension, which is to say that, yeah, of course, I like things I'm familiar with, I'm comfortable with, but I also like trying new things. And so balancing those two things out and recognizing that if you are going to personalize things, then do it really subtly and do it in a kind of way that's engaging to me, that doesn't make me feel like I'm being kind of put in a box or stereotyped. And it comes back to told what to do. And I think one of the interesting things that you talked about Netflix, curating your feeds, that should be a good thing, right? It's specially curated for you, ought to be a positive thing. But when it's done really crassly, which is, David's the fire guy, so let's just show anything with the word fire in it, right? Must be interesting to him. Now, on one level, that could produce some amazing results, right? Where you might, on the other hand, maybe you're also the water guy, right? To pick the opposite, and maybe you need that. And I think that's where it's a bit crass at the moment. And my hope is it gets a lot smarter. and we can start to customize some of these things in really intelligent ways that also allows for serendipity. To my, it's a bit like the example. So if you travel somewhere else, there's no point in traveling across the world and then just, I don't know, eating something you can get at home and experiencing something. You want that fresh experience. And so I think we all thrive. And that's why human interaction is great, because we sort of have a format for how it's going to play out, but you never quite know. You meet interesting people. What do we talk about? The answer is I don't talk about. I met some dullard who had some really boring stories that similar experience to mine. You talk about the wacky person that you came across with an interesting insight, or the left field thing you weren't expecting to happen. The pattern, the matrix are broken slightly, if you like. And so I think that's, I think it is possible, but I do think we default to idealized solutions, as you say, and that plays itself out in our daily lives. And I find myself constantly seeking things that are a little bit different. They're probably not, actually. They've probably been done by a million people before, but it feels different to me. And that point, all of this to me points to around perception and how we see the world. And of course, perception isn't necessarily reality, but these are and none of this is straightforward. None of this is straightforward at all. So we've got to think cleverly about how we do it. And I think what you're pointing towards is, it's almost like it's in the too difficult box in some cases. So let's do the thing where we give everybody a standardized thing. And customization, personalization, because of digital technology, it can happen. But actually, we also occasionally want things to be left field and weird and go wrong. I don't want my trains to be cancelled all the time so I can't get where I need to get to. But equally, when everything runs to clockwork in every aspect of my life, that's also a bit boring.
My sense is, I guess my concern in some ways is that I take your point. I entirely agree that we will get smarter at how we understand that human piece. I would question whether the current approach is the right one that will get us there, because I think we have to be better at examining what that human piece is. So, for example, as you've alluded to the role of emotions. I think if you take your standard approaches of doing a customer journey map and it looks at where you're trying to get to, not so much about the way that that's going to experience. And I think if you took sport, in theory now, we could get a team, whichever you support, let's say football, you've got team A and B, you can get the stats and data on the individual players and on the team in the last few years. You could probably run it through the computer and tell us who's going to win. We don't need all of that.
No point watching the game, right? Because I know what the result's going to be.
Exactly. That's done. And you think, but actually that's not the point. It's the experience of being with people. It's the experience of the highs and lows. And I think, again, it's that something we're missing is, and this is where it's really difficult. We haven't got the tool set well embedded. And like I said earlier about my interest in the risk and crisis space coming across, are better at understanding uncertainty and planning for it. It's a different skill set, it's a different mindset. But the reality is that it is true for the commercial sector. And there are fundamental issues I get concerned about. So as we digitize, as we remove opportunities to talk to each other, in the commercial space, it makes perfect sense from an efficiency perspective, consistency perspective, but actually societal. So the collective impact is negative on society. For many people, those interactions are really important to them. They may be sometimes the only conversation they have, the only reason they have to get out of the house. And certainly when we look at crises and disasters, societal resilience is incredibly important because the type of risks we are now facing are more complex, they're more long and lasting. And they're not going to be solved just by emergency responses. And we see it in almost every recent emergency. But if you break the very thing that we need to enhance, that societal resilience, the people who know people, the contacts you've got, that sense of belonging, that becomes harder. So we've got two sectors almost going in different directions. And I think, as you say, one of the difficulties, we actually have to accept that it's difficult, it's probably almost impossible to predict, but we grow through adversity. And if we take that away, so if you design interactions with your customers with the aim of perfect consistency, no variability, and no really negative impact, it makes logical sense. It also means we won't get the growth for some people that defines them. There are many stories of people that hit the point of adversity and went on to do some incredible good. So I think, as I say, it feels to me, if we go and say, look, we can get data and we can layer emotional interpretation on, it's to an extent like building Frankenstein's monster. Can we get a sum of the parts to make it human? I would argue no. I would suggest that we need to be better at understanding what human is, and then use those tools and technology in a different way to reflect as it is. Because I think if not, we actually might find a bigger gap between what the system and the data tells us should happen and actually what does happen. And we'll know why it's true. It's not clever. It's instinctive that you can see how we behave. Professionals don't always follow their own advice. And I think closing that gap rather than let it actually widen is one of the real challenges we've got. And it starts with honest conversations about what does human mean to you. And that will differ for organizations. So in the same way culture does. But if we skip past that and just assume, well, obviously we know what human is, I think we're going to end up going down the wrong route, both in companies in the commercial sense, but also societally.
And I think a lot of what you're pointing towards is this sort of drive towards efficiency. Let's quantify what we can quantify. And if it seems like a waste of money, let's not spend money on it. And I think we saw lots of examples during the pandemic about just-in-time supply chains, very economically efficient, but that relies on a set of presumptions that may not turn out to be true. And so if you can't get things there quickly, suddenly you're in a much worse position because you've got nothing stockpiled at all. And so something that's economically sensible might not be that, we always struck, back to the fire service. They closed a lot of fire stations in London, and the logic was, they weren't needed. And you start to look at, I was fascinated to listen to conversations with firefighters where you'd have things like, well, what are they doing when they're not fighting fires? Well, the answer is they're helping to going out and doing fire prevention. Well, if they're really good at fire prevention, then logically there are less fires, but that doesn't mean they're not doing a good job. And I think also psychologically, back to your point earlier, is if I know there's a local fire station within a few minutes, that just reassures me. Now, it may be theoretically possible to get to the fire within the same amount of time, but there is something nice. Ditto, I'm worried about, we hear about, train stations. Well, we don't need anybody in the ticket office. Well, there are lots of people that do. And actually, we need those people for when it goes wrong, and we can't plan for those things. And I want that you can't measure the invisible benefits of having someone on a train station. Who knows what people might get up to when there's no one there, and who might need help. And I do think there's this interesting question about, as you say, and I think there's a little bit of digital thinking here. Digital's all about slick and efficient and cost effective. And sometimes we have to waste money in inverted commas, have backups and emergency supplies and things that don't make any sense until they do make sense. And so I think, and what does all that bring together? The answer is all the human attributes you were talking about.
It is so important. It's an area I'm fascinated with. There's a great quote by Maya Angelou. People will forget what you said, people forget what you did, but they'll never forget how you made them feel. And for me, that sense of how you make people feel is such a strong driver for the organizational performance. And to your point, the ticket office one is a very current example. It is a reassuring presence. And for people that may feel nervous about travel generally, may feel worried if it's later at night and vulnerable, how you feel is as important as the statistics. You can tell people in that situation, statistically, you're only going to have 1 in 50,000 chance that thing will happen. But if you think, well, that is one person and it could be me. So you don't actually provide the right experience if you don't manage how people feel and accept, as you say, that degree of variance. And I mean, even when I look at some of the work going on at the moment around like the 4-day week, if you come from a purely quantification measured system, clearly somebody working 5 days will do more work than somebody doing 4 days. And yet the results are showing very differently. And I think it's because there's all sorts of reasons, but how people feel is one aspect of that. And I guess coming back to the earlier point is what we tend to do is keep improving the current way of working. And rather than step back and say, what would it look like if we reframe this and looked at it differently? And I suspect that if you only had 4 days, you might start looking and say, well, okay, how do we organize this differently? All those tasks. So you'll get an improvement. I kind of feel maybe from the fact that people are more refreshed, they feel better value, they've got better life balance, they can do some of the stuff on that day, Friday, when other companies are available to sort out the problems they've got or get the windows fixed and things like that. But I also think there is something there about maybe companies are starting to look at how much this is really necessary, because it's just easy to keep piling layer on layer on layer. And a lot of the organizations that we look around were developed probably post-war and look largely like, and yet the world is very different. And it is difficult to change once you build up a large institution. But my hunch is, and hopefully we'll do some research around it soon, is kind of really start looking at the economic value of how people feel. Because I was on the train the other day and I was waiting for one, and there's a sign on the opposite side. It said, "No excuses." And it was aimed at customers who don't pay the fare. I thought, is it possible to really sit there and just imagine circumstances which I arrive at the station without a ticket? Not any intention to defraud. If I'll pay my ticket. It's just for whatever reason, I've had to get on the train. I don't have to get that point. I'm sure that happens hundreds of times every day. But the train companies, and we will not tolerate that. You'll get fined. And yet, by the same token, their train can turn late, can turn up dirty. I may not get a seat. And I think we notice these things. We notice how the supermarkets are treated. And it actually, I think, in many respects at the moment, we are creating some quite dangerous tensions because we, coming out of the pandemic particularly, the thing we most valued was the ability to reconnect, to have human-to-human contact. And as humans, we are incredibly social, and that is important to us. Organizations are still going in a very different direction, pushing the human contact way. And I think smart companies will understand what human means to them, and they will make sure that when they adopt the processes, they always remember that it's a human-to-human process with humans in between. The technology is not the solution. It's part of the way you can deliver it. But I see some really nice examples now where the investment in technology or new systems is done with the purpose of allowing humans, employees, to engage more with customers or stakeholders, build relationships, rather than just take it as a short-term cost saving. And I think that relationship aspect, again, to your point, in times of crisis, where do you go? You go where you've got a strong relationship, however compelling the other data, somebody that you can trust that's served you well before. And that's the bit that I think businesses and organizations just aren't really understanding. It's not a nice to do. I would argue that for companies that are going to survive long term, that's really where their focus should be, right?
I think that ticket example is really interesting because you can see what they're doing, right? Which is clearly there is a problem or perceived, may not actually be one, but there's let's assume they've done some research, right? There's clearly a problem with fare evasion. So you want to ward off those people. But I would argue that the average person who's deciding to deliberately evade fares is not going to be swayed by a poster telling them not to do it, right? Because particularly on the station platform, when they're already sat there, you're effectively pregnant with the decision to do it. You're not going to suddenly change up. Oh, do you know what? I was going to do that, but that poster's what swayed me. Right. That's very nice. And yet what it's done is it's pissed you off because you've sat there. And so you're irritated unnecessarily. And the criminal is not really deterred. Doesn't protect them from a legal position in the sense of, if you want to prosecute somebody for fare evasion, having a poster up doesn't really strengthen the legal case substantially. And therefore, what has it actually done? And I think you can get the message across in a more, if you wanted to put that out there. And I've seen some campaigns that are much more effective that use, social proof to demonstrate that most people buy their tickets or something positive as opposed to negative. But I loved your depiction of we can all find ourselves on the wrong side of the law, breaking a rule. And I always go as far as saying every single one of us, every single day, pretty much breaks a rule somewhere. Now, most of us are not out committing major acts of crime, but there'll be some rule that will break or some principle that will break. We'll do something we shouldn't do. Now, sometimes that's entirely valid because there's a really good reason for overriding the rule. It makes perfect sense. Other times it's just, we don't even know the rule exists, or do you know what? We've just had a bad day and something's gone particularly. And I think it's important to recognize that those things can happen. And as you say, because all will happen is I'll get irritated. And if I get fined by the rail company, how does that help my relationship with them? If it's a one-off thing, of course you want to deter people that are cheating the system. And we all understand this on a basic level. And I find it absolutely fascinating that when we've got people taking decisions, and I think often it's people taking decisions who don't experience these things. Yeah. So it's very easy. If let's pick up, I'm sure they all use their own service. But hypothetically, if you're running the train service and you're being chauffeured to work every day and you don't experience it. And that's why I love companies that force their employees to experience the thing that the service, go see what it's like to be a customer, I think is really, really important. But lots of you said at the beginning that lots of structures that we have are not delivering; they're not fit for purpose. I guess would be a simple way to put it. And I think some of that's to do with people making decisions. Whether that's politicians who are making decisions about social security, things that they never experience and never going to experience themselves. I think that's really dangerous.
Absolutely. And I think it is one of those areas, as you say, I think you have to have either a lived experience of it or create an opportunity to really immerse yourself in it and understand certainly at a human level what it's like. But I think, again, one of the dangers we have is we've created siloed approaches. And obviously, anywhere you go now is we're overcoming silos, same language translation between different departments, different organizations. But as a human, we experience it in the round. And the transport one I find fascinating, that so many areas of life, as a consumer, you have been made worse. And so my local train station is an inch towards app-based parking. And every time I go in the car park, wherever it is, there's a cluster of people around the car parking ticket, looking at it in bewilderment as to, I'm not sure. It doesn't seem to take coins. I've got to phone this number. I've got to text it. Anything. We've gone from, I turned up, put some coins in the machine, got a ticket out. There's no data transaction. There's no relationship. I've got what I need, and I know I've got what I need. Whereas now I can spend 5 or 10 minutes working out what the hell it means and still risk getting a fine. And I think it's a really aggressive and impersonal system. And it's not one I chose. It's not offered me any advantages. In fact, it's worse than I had before. But it has saved the company money from having to collect tickets. But they've done it to us. They've not done it with us. And I think the ticket office is another one where they've told us what the solution's going to be, and do we like the solution, rather than working with us. And the transport is a really interesting one. I mean, again, I suppose if you give the example of like parking wardens, we build hostility into the role because of what we ask them to do. Because their job is to effectively, particularly where we've outsourced, to drive revenue. Nobody wants to see the parking meter officer around their car. And often that will immediately create some tension and worse. And I do think, again, it's that role. What is the role of parking officers? Is it to generate revenue for a private company and outsource from council or responsibility? Or is it to help make towns or wherever they're based useful and enjoyable experience? Because from that, they then go into the commercial activities once you've parked. That sets up your frame of mind. If you've had a really bad experience or you're fretting about, I can't believe I parked or whether I've got a ticket, that comes with you into the first encounter you have in the store. Or we don't lose that emotion. And when I think about organizations, and I guess for your sort of role, when we talk about risk, I think organizations have to look at how they actually culpable for some of the risk that's built into the role by way of what they're asking. Because again, if I reframed parking warden from that kind of focus on revenue and you're just an inch over the line, so I'm going to issue a ticket, to your job is to make this place that's pleasant to park and the traffic flows, then actually become useful. As a member of the public, I've become interested in how you can help me find somewhere to park that's useful. The revenue may go down in one respect. Actually, the visitor rate and visitor satisfaction would massively increase, and the relationship for that employee would be a better option. You'd have people maybe wanting to take that role on because it's a customer facing role, not something where you risk being the most hated person in town. And I just think organizations really need to look at that. I mean, again, going back to supermarket, it's creating a distance. There are, in the way that it puts their staff in a different position because the technology, I think, is somewhat clumsy and impersonal. And it creates more of a friction or likelihood of friction with staff who are trying to oversee it and have to keep coming up to put in the new code because it didn't register. And so I think that there is, from a risk perspective, and kind of welcome your thoughts on it, organizations can't just stand there and say the risk is inherent in our customers or employees. There is a culpability aspect by which they're contributing to quite significantly, actually. And that whole customer blaming thing, I feel is something I see a lot of, and actually is often very unwarranted and unhelpful.
I agree completely. And I think it's this, if we wish it a certain way, it will become that way. And so we would like all of our, we'd like everybody to do this. and therefore we're just gonna force that to happen. We're gonna come up with standardized, and you see this, I think, standardized solutions that might be sensible, and I stress the might in one context. If something created in head office that makes perfect sense, and then it sort of sit on the ground, you think, well, actually, that's really dumb. And I think, humans are. I find what I find really interesting is that we know all of us know this. Humans are inventive and creative, and if we don't like something, we find ways around it. And so I think, if my relationship with an organization, either as an employee or as a customer, becomes transactional, and I think they're trying to rip me off, and they're just treating me like they're not delivering me a personal service. They don't trust me. Then I'm just going to return that favor. And, so if I think there's lots of examples where it's not in the business's interest for that relationship to build, because you sort of think, I hate going to this place. I hate this. Is an awfully, anytime you have to go to a government office to get something done, and you sort of sit there and you walk into this dreary looking building because we've cut costs again. Let's not make it a nice environment for people. And then let's make them go through a hideous process. And again, I come back to the earlier conversation about if we're experiencing something that we're forced into where we don't have to do it that often, you just sit there, and we're not going to be nice and engaging with people. If the whole experience of getting to sit in front of an individual has been hideous and awful, of course, we're not going to be in a positive frame of mind when we're doing that. And so I think it's, how do we, why is this why customer satisfaction levels are low? Well, because you treated them like they were, an alien that you could just shout abuse at. And I almost, words fail me sometimes when I look at some of these things, because you just think it's actually relatively easy to come up with a more, I'm not saying you can come up with a perfect approach, but making things more human. And I think a lot of this, to my mind, is, and this is implicit in your comment about research, I think a lot of this is about, we should design things and then try it. Ideally, test it in a small way before we go big with something. But we should recognize that every single thing we design is an attempt to influence humans, to get humans to behave in a particular way, to get a particular outcome. And we should be looking and saying, is it doing that or not? And if it's not, we should be absolutely willing to change and be recognized. And of course, what worked a year ago, 2 years ago, pre-pandemic, for example, might not work now. And so I think often people think about this as job done. Right, I'll design this structure. Let's roll the rules out. Job done. I'll move on to the next thing. And I think life's not that simple. And we have to adapt. We all, as you say, right, my mood can differ from one moment to the next, let alone as I'm getting older or have medical conditions or financial issues, whatever it is. We're going to, that's just a natural part of who we are. And so for me, I agree with your quest to make things more human and to think about it. But I think that requires us to be more adaptable and to be less certain of things and embrace uncertainty and messiness.
Yeah. And you touched on trust. And it's an area I'm fascinated by. That you're probably familiar with the Edelman Trust Barometer that measures trust in organizations. I think many times the bigger barrier for me is the trust organizations have in those it serves, whether that's commercial sense or as citizens. That's not measured, interestingly, but it is the bigger barrier. And I think we need to find ways to bridge that gap. That organizations, whether it's commercial or public, need to be better at engaging with and trusting the people they work with. And what does that look like in practical terms? I love the pianos at train stations.
Yeah.
And I don't know the origin of it. I must find out one time. In theory, if you took a proper approach to the train station, obviously they've done an amazing job with a lot of the stations of refurbishments, created really nice environments. And obviously the mood from music is a key part of that. It would be sensible that they then say, well, we want to create either an energetic feel or a relaxed feel or a classy feel. And so they would own the music system and we'd have it piped through. None of us would actually ever tell what was heard because it's just in the background. The fact they just put piano there and kind of almost dared you to play it, I love, because it means it's live theatre. It's spontaneous. We respond well to that. It may mean that sometimes you walk through and there's no music. That's okay. We don't actually notice its absence or presence in that respect. But when somebody's playing the piano, we do. And I've seen some really nice examples. It actually makes me better memory of the experience of the station, the piped music. And I think there are ways, even to your example, kind of the spaces we live as public buildings. I'm sure there are community groups that say, look, we would make this a place that we would want to come. We can do this. It doesn't have to necessarily go through a contract process. These are public services working for public people, but that gap has got so big that connection's broken. And I just think it is that sense of we're going to the lowest common denominator. It's almost like for, I suppose, human resources. In 1973, somebody stole a pen from our company. We now assume that everyone would if they gave them an opportunity. So we have a 5-page manual on how to stop people stealing pens. You think, is that just an acceptable loss? If you employ 100 people, yes, some stationery is going to go. We got it. We're not too fast. But back to your early point about the railway side, the 99 people that never even crossed their mind, you're probably really annoyed because it's one policy amongst many that says, of course we love you, but we also think you'd rip us off and steal or cheat in some way. And you think that doesn't build any trust. And I think trust will become the biggest currency, but it takes a brave step for many organizations to move from where they are to an extent what some of the solutions offered to them are, at surveillance and actually buck that trend. If they want engagement, if they want people to come back because they've been made to feel good, they feel trusted and valued. You cannot do that by constantly treating everyone at the lowest level of your risk.
And the piano, I think, is such a great example. So, for listeners unfamiliar in fresh trains, I mean, the most famous one is St Pancras Station in London, where when you come out of the Eurostar, which is trains from Paris and Brussels, there's a piano there that anybody can play. And so there's lovely video. And actually, even if you've never been there, there's videos online. I mean, John Legend once, I think, tweeted, he said, is that piano still there? And got off the Eurostar and started playing, created a massive crowd. And we've seen lovely duets and people do. And you go there sometimes and you're right, no one's playing. Other times it's someone that really can't play, but it doesn't matter, right? It's just this random moment. And you tell you what, and I remember every time I walk past that, I think somebody's made a decision here to spend some money on something that's frivolous. And it's beautifully frivolous and it's great and it's uplifting and it's just, as you say, it just injects this element of humanity. And what's fascinating for me is I regularly do St Pancras and to Brussels, and they put one in Brussels Midi, which is the terminus in Brussels. And it had exactly the same effect. Joyous thing. And I was like, oh, they've got one here. That's really cool. And they've now got rid of it. And it turned this, and it's not the nice, St Pancras is a nice station. Brussels is not a very nice station. And it turned this sort of slightly grotty space into something quite nice, and just there was something to do. And it was just like, and I can't play the piano, but it doesn't matter. I'll just enjoy the moment of somebody else doing it or trying to do it, whatever. And they moved it. And it was a really interesting point because I thought, well, it's obviously only a temporary basis sponsored, but I don't know. But how expensive is that in the scheme of things? Not very. How much joy does that bring to people? And particularly if you're having to cancel services or this stuff is a bit annoying. What a nice idea. And on the pens, I hate it when I don't know if you can do this nowadays because I hardly ever walk into a branch of a bank, but those biros that are chained up, right? Because you might steal it. And I love companies that embrace that because you get lots of businesses that take the opposite approach and go, people are going to nick stuff. So let's make it a feature. Let's recognize it as marketing potential. Someone takes one of our pens, right? Maybe that means we downgrade the quality of the pens. Maybe we put something cheaper. Doesn't matter. But if it gets stolen, well, we just treat that as a marketing price and we make sure our logo is properly displayed on it. Right. And who knows what benefit that might have. And I think all of this stuff is pointing towards, as you say, it's not about what's the cheapest way I can do things. It's actually what's the most human way I can do things. And I think those benefits are harder to quantify, but actually they really matter to all of us.
Yeah. And I think we will get there. It's just we're not as familiar with them in the commercial sector. As I say, other sectors, it's more their way of working, but they obviously do it for different purposes. And I genuinely think, as you say, with that example, the bit I like about the piano is it has equity. Anyone can sit down and play it, whether you're 10, 90, whether you're skilled or not. That's part of the drama. It doesn't require any entry level. For on that day, one person could be a star. If they capture the mood, they capture a crowd, that can be a memory that they will take them for life.
Hi, it's Christian here, just stopping the discussion for a second to tell you that after we'd finished recording, I made an amazing discovery. I really wanted to know the history of the piano at St Pancras Station in London, and so I did some research. And what I discovered was that the original piano that was there, which I think has now been replaced, was actually donated to the station by Sir Elton John. And you can watch a video of him playing it for the first time in that location via a link in the show notes. Right, with that important announcement over, back to the show.
And I just think, as you say, we get so linear in our way and just so stuck in this is how we do it, rather than that counterintuitive of what if. Let's go play. Let's be curious. Let's be creative and see how people respond. Because it's very difficult to say how they will respond. I mean, obviously, culture, locality, and all those things play a part. But when you get it right, it creates, I think, an impact that's way beyond any normal way. And just with pens, you think, I think, make it a point of fun. How far can we get a pen to travel? How far can you take our pen? Get creative with it because, as you say, particularly with social media and things now, you can really think differently about this, and it can be money really well spent. But that whole, I think, loss aversion and distrust really limits companies from engaging with them. And as I say, as they now put in more layers of security and check-in, they're just widening a distance that I don't think sustainable. We're seeing lots of areas where people are dissatisfied in many areas of their life. And I think that's actually quite dangerous as well, from an emergency sort of perspective.
And I think that the point you made around the piano is interesting as well, because that democratization, I think, points to an inclusion or inclusiveness, which I think is really important because lots of people feel disenfranchised on some level. And so this idea that something is not for you, whether that's a career path or whether that's an experience. And sure, some things are exclusive and can't be available to everybody. But I think to the extent that we can make everybody feel part of something and not demonize people or assume the worst in people, I think there's a lot to be said for, yeah, sure, we put in place protections, right? We don't leave proverbial bank vaults unlocked just so that people can wander in and help themselves. We need to put protections in place. But I think in many respects, as you say, we just build layer on layer of process and controls and locks and things. And a basic level makes sense, but you get to a stage where it becomes so costly and so defining, and actually, I think poses more risk because as you say, it's the unpredictable human bit. 20 locks on something feels sensible until you're the human that experiences. Maybe you're the person that has to unlock those 20 locks, or you're somebody who looks at it and just is experiencing the downside of going through that process. Then that comes at a cost, and I think it's that cost that's hidden very often. It's back to the point where we started. Is sort of actually the cost of losing a treasured family possession in a fire means I'll do things that perhaps I shouldn't under any other circumstances. But for me, in the moment, that's the sensible thing. Is that human connection with something. And so we lose that if we just think in terms of economics or we just think in terms of efficiency.
And when we did our study, we ended up speaking to hundreds and thousands of people. Almost nobody regretted the actions they took. And I think that was a really powerful thing, that you have to accept people make the choices they make. For some people, putting their life at risk for a pet is perfectly reasonable because they can't imagine life without the pet. It's their only companion. It means no difference to them to another person. And I think we have to be better at respecting choices. And as you say, I mean, I think one of those areas is we seem to be just having this mass adoption of, you mentioned it earlier, kind of that. If somebody wants to cheat on the rail fare, they will find a way to do it. You will not stop those, or it'd be very difficult to stop that. But you may stop the casual one or somebody that just sees the opportunity. But by treating everyone in that way, you have a very, very significant loss. And I think, as you say, if we play to that creativeness, I mean, the piano is a prop. And I think companies really, if they want to engage, not every company will need to, but if you want to create a memory, that piano sponsored by somebody or some entertainment built around it by that company would create a memory that's worth having. And if you give people props, that inventiveness can be used in a really fantastic way. And I think for customers, that becomes more interesting. Banks don't have to be dull and boring. You can have some challenges in there. Mix it up a little. Of course you want the security, but don't. We went to a pub recently who obviously had a problem because they're near a beauty spot with people parking and just walking off and not using their facility, which that's a reasonable problem. Their solution was to put in video cameras and warning signs. So if you were a user of the pub, by the time you even got into the front door, it felt unpleasant. The first question as you walked in is or the first requirement, you need to register your car. And by the way, at the end of your meal, you can't stay in a car park if you want to go for a walk. So the whole experience has been framed by this. Not that, and online, when you look, there was a lot of negativity from locals who actually would have been the ones that sustained their trade during the winter. So for this period of maybe 5 or 6 days a year where you've got beautiful weather and yes, maybe people were parking, they'd gone straight into that security sanction-based approach rather than making it more enticing to those that did park. Perhaps you could have a caravan at the end of the car park on the route to the walk where you sell the things. But it's just, I think for me, it's just that linearity and default to one view of the world that's going to cause many companies problem because it becomes sequential because, as you said, you don't necessarily solve the problem. And in supermarkets, I don't think are necessarily solving the problem around theft, but they keep adding more layers. And I think like many people, it's becoming very, very intrusive on my experience to the point where, the first one that offers a new model of shopping I like, I'm off. I have no loyalty to any of those supermarkets because they've created that boundary. And I just kind of feel that, say, if we get better at understanding human, all that means, the uncertainty, what the trust means, how it looks, we create a much better intersection. And I believe, but it's better for the organization in terms of the performance they want, create much better experiences and the ability for us as society to grow, to have resilience, to learn new skills. And those sort of things can be built into our interactions with companies as well.
Fantastic. David, I think that is a brilliant note on which to end. We could keep talking, and I'm sure we'd have lots more things to talk about, but time as ever is against us. But look, if people want to get hold of you to find out more, how can they do that?
Okay. On LinkedIn, there's David Wells, MSc. They can connect with me there. Or you can go to my company website, which is sharedaim.co.uk, and there's a contact form on there.
Fantastic. Links to both of those things, as ever. And some of the things that we talked about in the show will be in the show notes. But David, all that remains for me to say is thank you for firstly bringing a human touch to something I have not had the misfortune of experiencing, but I know that at least one or two listeners will have done, which is with the fire service, really, really important role. But I think that bringing that human touch to it and thinking is very, very powerful. So thank you for that, the research that you do and the work that you do, which I think is incredibly important as we've outlined. But above all, thank you for being a fabulous guest on the show.
Thank you so much for having me, Christian, and it's been an absolute pleasure to speak to you.
Likewise.
So that's it for this episode of the show. My enormous thanks to David for appearing and to you for listening. To find out more about the subjects we talked about, to get in touch with David, and to see some of the links to, for example, Sir Elton John playing at St Pancras Station, have a look in the show notes. There are links to those there. If this is your first time listening to the Human Risk podcast, welcome. You can subscribe wherever you get your quality audio content. It's available on all of the major podcasting platforms. If you like the show and have yet to leave a review wherever you're getting hold of it, please do so. It really, really does help. I'll be back very soon with another episode of the show, but in the meantime, stay safe. Remember, the human touch is really important. And thank you so much for listening.